Greetings all, D&Disability here, and welcome back. This is actually our second attempt at recording this video. So, greetings, Father Aaron, welcome to the show. I like to bring in experts to answer questions from time to time, at least if and when I can. For those who don't know, what is your clerical background?
My clerical background is that I'm a priest in the Anglican Church of Canada.
Really, why you're here today and why I'm inviting you in is so that we can get a decent overview of clerics, clergy, and kind of how we can continue with my running mini series on effectively clergy, disability, and effectively kind of understanding where these intersect in our fantasy role-playing games.
All
And
right.
of course, see my video on, medieval clergy and disability and stuff on the that video for those details. And next week I'll be coming out with a video on deities and disabilities, so keep your eyes open for that one. But
Cool.
for the time being, for the now, can you give us a general overview of the clergy?
Oh, that's a narrow topic. Let's see. Well, in terms of the modern church, and in my own denomination, I can't speak for others, but in my own denomination and in most of what you would term the liturgical denominations, Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, the clergy person that a parishioner would meet on a Sunday, if you walked into any church, the person leading the liturgy is usually going to be a priest. The priest is ordained to facilitate worship, to lead worship in a congregation or in a parish. But there are actually other orders of the clergy. The three orders of ordained clergy that the church has currently, at least again in my denomination, are deacons, priests, and bishops. All of them, going way, way back to the early church. The oldest of them would be the bishops, and they are the inheritors of the apostles. So a bishop is in charge of an area, a region, a geographic area known as a diocese. And all of the churches, the parishes within that diocese are under the authority of that bishop. And the bishop has a role as a teacher, a guardian of the faith. So to pass on from generation to generation the faith as received, to not alter anything, to not monkey around with it, but to hand it on. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no adaptation or no change. St. Paul talks about being all things to all people. And so to speak the ancient truth, sometimes you need to learn new languages, right? And so things adapt and change. But the episcopacy has a particular role to make sure that those changes, while they may affect the outward and some appearances and the delivery, they ought not affect the core faith. Great disagreements erupt over what that core faith is and where the line is drawn, but there's the essential role of the bishop. As I said, the priest is the person that most people would encounter. That is the newest of the ordained positions. Priests came along later, so I'll skip over them for now to go to deacons. Deacons, that goes back, you can find in the book of Acts, when this is shortly after Jesus' resurrection and ascension, and the apostles are teaching, and they're overwhelmed with work. They've got all these new people coming, and they've got to teach them the basics, right? I mean, well, okay, this is what we're talking about. And at the same time, they have widows and orphans. They have people who are sick, people who are in need of help, and they're just too busy to take care of everything. And so they appoint some assistants, helpers, servants, diakonos in Greek, people to serve, to help, to take care of some of those aspects, the sort of outreach and charitable work of the church, to free them up for the teaching and the role that they were given to do. And so another ordained position in the nascent church was born, that of a servant. And to this day, the deacon's work is focused on, out of the parish, is focused on ministry to the poor, ministry to the sick. It is, as the deacon of our parish, our deacon has since moved way, way north, so we don't have a deacon in our parish anymore. But when we did, he was fond of saying that the priest ministers to the church gathered, whereas the deacon ministers to the church scattered. So the deacon's focus is out in the community. And you see the deacon wearing, vestments in church. All the ordained clergy wear special clothes, vestments. and the deacon will wear a stole that goes crosswise over his or her body. The priestly stole goes around the neck, so it hangs like a scarf kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. So clergy then is, for at least from, let me parse what we have here. So
Mm-hmm.
working from the top down, the bishop then basically keeps the faith, ensures that everything kind of stays the same. The faith might be transmitted in a new message, but really they're
Yep.
the ones in charge, you might say, in a sense of coordination. And
Yeah.
then you have the priests below them, which we'll come to here in a minute, and then who are in charge of the regular congregation, as well as specific rites. And then we have the deacons who are in charge of the effectively the scattered congregation in
Yeah.
a sense that they bring the word of the faith out into the community, offer aid, but then if I understand them correctly, do not have the ability to give certain rights.
Correct. The deacons don't do called ABCs, the absolution, blessing, or consecration of the Eucharist. So they certainly do participate in the sacraments, and they also, in addition to going out into the world on a Sunday morning, they would have, or in any liturgy, they would have a particular role. Deacons generally read the gospel. They're the ones who proclaim the gospel. They'll serve at altar. They'll often lead the prayers of the people, because part of that role of going out into the world and bringing the church's resources and care into the world is then they bring the cares and concerns of the world into the church, right? They bring those to the altar. So they'll lead the prayers, which is intercessions for those in need, etc. That's about it. The bishops, I'd also say, would have a role as the centers of unity around which the church is gathered. So within a diocese, you'll have churches that are very, again, I'm speaking in an Anglican context, you'll have churches that are very high church, incense and ritual, very, very elaborate. The saints are invoked, and that's the kind of church I like, by the way. But in the same diocese, sometimes a block away, you'll have a church where it's guitars and drum kits, and the priest is in jeans and a t-shirt, and it doesn't look anything like the sort of medieval rite that's happening. In fact, the church that I first experienced the Anglican ethos in was a cathedral in Milwaukee, All Saints, and a block away there's another Episcopal church. It's Episcopal in the United States because you can't call it Anglican, which means English, when you've just kicked the English out, right? So they renamed themselves Episcopal, which just means led by bishops. Anyway, the Episcopal Cathedral is one block away from St. Paul's Church, which is very, very famously very, very low church, it's called. Not a lot of fancy, not a lot of ritual. The people at All Saints like to call it Mr. Paul's because it was so low. But so the bishop, though, is a center of unity around which, even though these churches are very different in their expressions, they're all under one bishop. But speaking of the parish, the priest is the one who is the rector, which is where we get like director. It just means the person who's leading, who's in charge of a parish. And a parish is also a geographic reality. It's not just the building and the people who go there, although in the car culture it becomes that, because you can drive through 8 parishes on your way to the one you prefer on Sunday morning, right?
Is there a specific number of parishes a bishop's in charge of, or does it range wildly?
Wildly. Generally speaking, if people, and thus churches, are thin on the ground, like in the Canadian North, the dioceses are massive. They're huge. Whereas in the area of Canada where I am, the diocese in which I serve, Niagara, is relatively small. It's relatively small geographically, but because there's a lot of people living here, there's no, it's not a fixed number of churches. But the parish, as I said, it's a geographic reality. And again, northern parishes might be massive and still only have a tenth of the people who are in a parish in the middle of Toronto, for instance, or New York or whatever. And in that reality, the priest is in charge of the spiritual care of every soul who lives within the parish bounds. Now, obviously, in a post-Reformation world where there's all these different denominations, and in a multicultural world where there's all these different religions and no religion whatsoever, not everyone wants that care. But within the parish, if someone comes to me and says, my mother has died, can we have the funeral? It is my obligation to say yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Um, and I don't fuss too much about where the parish boundaries are. So if someone comes from 6 parishes over and makes the same request, I say yes as well, if they're coming to us for the funeral. But generally speaking, you're in charge of the area in which you're found. So for instance, if I was asked to do a wedding and it was located in another parish, I would call that priest and say, look, this couple has asked me to do a wedding. It's in your parish. So you respect those boundaries to a certain extent. But the priest is in charge of all of the sacraments, which in the Christian faith are the classic definition, the outward and visible signs of an inward and spiritual grace. So something that is physical and done, which communicates a spiritual reality. So baptism, there's water involved, there's oil involved, there's things you can touch and smell, and the Eucharist is bread and there's wine.
Ritual.
In an anointing, for healing, there's oil again on the forehead. So there's things you can touch, but they communicate things that we can't.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Role of the priesthood, I said it's the newest of the ordained positions in the church, but in a sense it's the oldest because priests are found in ancient Judaism, they're found in pagan religions, it's essentially the role of the arbiter between divinity and humanity, the one who on behalf of humanity makes the sacrifice, offers the prayer, and who on behalf of divinity proclaims absolution. It's not the priest forgiving people. I'm not forgiving people. I mean, I do. I try not to hold grudges, but that doesn't matter because it's just me. The priest acts as vehicle for that. So in terms of conscience that we're talking about, in a D&D gamified kind of world, the priests in your game, NPCs or whatever, would be the ones who had charge of the ritual and whatever equates to sacrament,
Mm-hmm.
sacrifices, etc. Deacons would be the kind of people you would see out and about helping the poor and the sick, etc. And your bishops would be in larger cities. A village doesn't have a bishop, right?
And of
A
course,
city has a bishop.
we aren't getting into specific orders like
No,
mendicants, Lutherans, etc. We also aren't getting into
right.
the subdivisions of, say, deacons, clergy, and how those hierarchies can be
Oh yeah.
stratified, right? That could go infinitely deep, right?
Oh, you
But
could go all over the place. Like an archdeacon isn't a deacon, it's a priest.
mhm,
An archbishop is a bishop who just has control of a larger or more impressive diocese. Yeah. And cardinals, they're really just bishops with particularly prominent, important cardinal primary
mhm,
dioceses.
mhm.
Um,
So we have these three branches of the same tree in a way,
mhm. uh,
right?
and I've been remiss. There's a fourth as well,
Okay, go ahead.
and this is more of a modern understanding of the church, I will say.
We can bring modern
But
modern understandings into a fantasy game. We can also bring ancient
beautiful.
ones. So,
That's true. The fourth ordained position in the church would be the laity,
yeah.
and people are ordained to that in their baptism. So it's really 4 orders, and the laity have the job of within the church. There are some lay jobs: reader, intercessor, etc., things like that. But more importantly, their job is to then go out and be carpenters, accountants, truck drivers, teachers, bankers, whatever, but to do those jobs in the ethos, of the love of God for the world. So the Christian outside of church is to live in as close a manner to the love of Christ as possible. None of us do that perfectly ever, which is why I still have a job in absolution. But that's a role too. So on that, again, thinking in game terms, every NPC you meet in an area, if they are part of that religious tradition, and there may be mixing of different traditions in a city, or this village may just be all of one, and whatever, but those people would have some obligations and some charism that has to do with that faith, which is why you have things like festivals and feasts, and you have periods of fasting, and that the entire community participates in, right?
And
Um,
differences in behavior, tenets, what is seen
mhm.
as moral, immoral,
Yeah,
etc.
yeah,
Um,
and yeah, and you get comments like, "Well, that wasn't very Christian of him, was it?" You know,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
you are. We're also not talking here about monks, nuns. Those are sometimes ordained individuals, but if they are, that's into one of the orders. But they're largely lay people. It's a lay religious life,
mm-hmm.
but it's organized around a rule of life. A rule of life that says we're going to pray and we're going to work and we're going to study. That's classic Benedictine model.
Mm-hmm.
And the life will be ordered. We will take a vow of poverty. We'll take a vow of celibacy. Sometimes a vow of silence.
Yep.
Uh, Things like that. So they have a whole other set of requirements, and they organize in monasteries or convents. The interesting thing is the abbot or abbess. Abbot comes from Abba, which means father, and abbess, mama, mother. Pope too, Papa, and in the Eastern Church, patriarchs. But the abbess and the abbot, you will see often depicted in, at least in iconography and in stained glass windows. You'll see an abbess with a crozier. And of course, in the Middle Ages, women weren't made bishops. In my tradition, they are today. But she'll be holding a crozier because an abbess and an abbot was considered to be on a level with a bishop. You
Mm-hmm.
know, so it's kind of a neat little dynamic that could
Interesting.
have an impact in your fantasy world. It's
No,
actually, don't
absolutely,
tell my
because
kids, it's about to have an impact in ours. Don't
yeah,
tell them.
okay, that's yeah, because that is interesting. Because when it comes to, if we take the modern example of, say, the Pope, right?
Mhm.
Certain cardinals, certain bishops, then the cardinals are allowed to vote in the Pope in that
Yes.
sense, but yet the abbots, abbesses don't necessarily have a voice in that.
Right, yeah, because the cardinals, again, are those bishops who are in charge of cardinal dioceses, very big,
Hmm.
impressive, important dioceses. So yeah, they're sort of way up there.
So here's a question which I've always wondered, which I've never gotten a straight answer for. That is until the previous interview, and then we lost the interview because thank you, Zoom.
Now,
Um,
I'll try to remember what I said then, because if I
well,
answer it differently now, it'll be all weird.
that's okay. Answer it however you choose, but it's how do you advance? Do you go
Ah,
from a deacon to a priest to a bishop to a cardinal? Does somebody just
right.
show up your house one day and you're like, "Hey, guess what, kid? You're a bishop now. Have fun." Merry
Well,
Christmas. Good luck.
in the Roman Church, yeah, kinda. In the Roman Church, kinda, the bishops are appointed by the Pope with advice. Obviously, the Pope can't possibly know every possible. And again, I can't speak to the intricacies in other denominations. I can speak to mine.
Of course, that's all I ask.
Some people are ordained as deacons. That is what they are called to do. They are called to that order of ministry, and that is who they are. We call them vocational deacons or permanent deacons. They're not going anywhere. That's what they're here to do. In one way it is, and one way it isn't, considered a lesser order. The priest is in charge of the parish. The deacon serves through a parish, and the deacon is under the supervision and guidance of the priest. But it's the same dynamic as a lieutenant and a sergeant.
Mm-hmm.
If the lieutenant knows what he or she is about, he's going to respect the sergeant because the sergeant has earned those stripes and probably knows what's going on. Whereas the lieutenant might be wet behind the ears just out of ROTC, right?
Mm-hmm.
A priest is technically superior or has supervision of the deacon, but it doesn't end up as a power thing. At any rate, to become a priest in the Anglican Church, you are first ordained a deacon. I think that's probably consistent across the liturgical churches that have deacons, priests, and bishops. You're first ordained a deacon. So I was ordained a deacon, and there's a sort of a trope: once a deacon, always a deacon. So that doesn't go away when you become a priest. You still have a diaconal service in you, which is why a parish priest, if you don't have a deacon, it's not like that parish doesn't do any outreach to the poor. The priest is a deacon as well, um, but takes on a new charism, a new role. And there are people who are ordained to the diaconate, and we call them transitional deacons. We know that that person is called to be a priest, or we are discerning the call to the priesthood,
Mm-hmm.
and we know that this is a preparatory period. But it is very much discernment, right? It's not like, I'd like to be a priest. Okay, come on in, right? It's good if you do. If a person's called to be the priesthood, to the priesthood, it's good if they feel that call and desire it. But there's a discernment to test that vocation. Is this person really called to be a priest? Is this person really called to be a deacon? Now, once a person is a priest, that's generally where their career will be. And the only, supposed advancement comes from getting maybe a larger parish or a more prominent parish.
Mm-hmm.
But there are priests. George Herbert in the English church, famously hugely talented person, hugely talented priest, could have been bishop 6 times over, didn't want to be, stayed in a tiny little, village parish
Mm-hmm.
and did his thing, wrote poetry, some of the most beautiful poetry the church has ever produced. And that's where he served and died. So advancement is not, there really is, a priest is a priest is a priest. Whether your parish has 1,000 families or 10, you're a priest.
Okay, so then where does this idea of the whole like stuck-up corrupt bishop thing come from? I mean, other than the French and the Avignon papacy and yada yada yada, but
Oh,
like
well,
how do you
bishops
go
are,
how do you go from a priest to bishop?
well, bishops are entirely stuck up. I say that as a priest. But so when the sitting bishop retires or dies, an election is announced, and candidates are put forward. Again, this is modern church. The candidates are put forward, and there will be a special synod called. The synod is when everyone is together. Synchronous, shares a root, and the bishop is elected.
Mm-hmm.
Candidates are nominated by other priests or lay people in the diocese. Sometimes you get the impression that a particular candidate went around looking for people to nominate him or her, right?
Mm-hmm.
Other times you get the impression that this person only grudgingly accepted nomination and would be horrified to win.
And traditionally, in a medieval sense, it was the Pope or the King that would also
Yes.
elect bishops as well. But yes,
Yes.
in a modern sense with the election, go on.
Yeah. Although in the Church of England, the Prime Minister appoints the bishops on the advice of the Crown, who actually gets the advice from the church. I mean, again, King Charles isn't going around talking to all the priests and finding out, which one would be a good bishop. I don't know. Neither is the prime minister showing up to church every Sunday, listening to sermons like, no, they listen to the advice of the church. But it is technically, yes, because the Church of England is the Church of England, it's a state religion, the bishops are appointed by the government. But yeah, in our case, they're elected. Although in the Middle Ages, it would have been the Pope. It could have been the local ruler. If the diocese in need of a bishop is far enough from any center of power, it might take months. And then there's cases where they were holding a synod to elect or choose a bishop, and a bird flew in and landed on somebody's head. It's like, that guy, because a bird landed on his head. There have been popes who were almost forced into the papacy and then ran away.
There have been popes like the Borgias who have bought their way in.
Yes, and there's been popes who didn't actually know any of the gospel at all.
So
It's happened.
good. So, but typically it's based largely on faith and having this notion or idea from someone's actions within the community that they are meant for a certain position.
Yeah,
Effectively.
there's a phrase in the Roman Church, Pability, like how popeable is this person? And it's the same thing within a diocese. You think of priests, and you think, oh, that guy's never going to be a bishop. I think I wear that label. Whereas other people, you think, that guy's going someplace.
So D&D clerics have some pretty serious power behind them in a religious sense. And I know that your views are that you see the clerics themselves as kind of the arm of the church, and here's where we disagree, but that's mostly
Right.
because clerics in D&D aren't allowed to use edged weapons. And if you're thinking about religious orders and arms of the church, I always think edged weapons. But
Right. Hospitalers and whatnot.
yes. But what does the role of the clergy writ large, clerics, paladins, etc., take in your games?
So, paladins in Beckme, because that's the system we play, is a category of fighter.
Mm-hmm.
It's not. It doesn't come out of the cleric order, so it is a separate thing. And actually, historically, those were the closest knights around Charlemagne,
Yep.
the paladins. So I would consider that a different. And that is a military order, a monastic military order.
Yep.
The Templars, Hospitallers, etc. To me, clerics live somewhere between the historic reality of the parish clergy and the historic reality of the Knights Templar, etc. They live somewhere in the middle, and they are a warrior branch. They have some of the clerical capacities. I mean, bless is a spell, right?
Mm-hmm.
And note, you can't do it at first level. So
Yep.
you do have to actually earn your way up into these things. At least in Beckme, you can't do spells as a cleric at first level.
It's the same thing fantasy when I play it as well. 5e,
Yeah.
no,
Yeah,
3e, no, but AD&D, yes, I think.
yeah, yeah. You don't have them at the beginning. So for me, they are warriors who have a religious obligation. They are a particular arm of the church. And so when I have, like, in my setting, there's a great city of Kilmarnock. Kilmarnock means the cell of Marnock. Marnock was a saint, a real life saint. There's a Kilmarnock in Scotland, but the real life Saint Marnock, kind of vague on the details of his life. Not much is known about him. So I felt free to just grab him and run with it, right? So for me, he was a cleric, and at his shrine, where his monastic cell had been, where his home had been, there are clerics who serve. Fighting clerics, clerics as in the character class who serve.
Mm-hmm.
But they're not in charge of the place. There are priests, there are deacons there that have their own roles. They don't come into the game as much because they don't have that utility behind them.
Well, do they
You don't
still
roll the
cast?
dice to see how many hit points you get back, kind of thing.
Do they still cast spells? Do they function effectively as clerics, say, without the weapon and armor proficiency?
Right. So there wouldn't be any weaponry. There wouldn't be any armor. To be perfectly honest, I haven't used them just
Mm-hmm.
because my players don't hang around cities much. They are bugging off into the wilderness, which is what you're supposed to do as an adventurer. But
Yeah, typically. Or you die in the sewers like I've done in Bill's game, but yeah.
yes, the sewer is always an attractive option. In theory, because I haven't actually had to apply myself to this, but in theory, they would have some spell casting ability, but it would be the things such as, cure light wounds, bless, cure diseases, maybe speak with dead, but it certainly would not be animate the dead. It wouldn't be finger of death or anything like that. It wouldn't be any of the combat-y sort of spells. Clerical spells aren't very combat oriented anyway, but there are a few who are. A few that are. I don't imagine they would be
Old person,
speaking with
command.
animals much. I don't know.
Eh,
Speak with animals though. That's Saint Francis. Maybe yes.
yeah, yeah, no, speak with animals could be interesting. Um,
Yeah.
and so this actually kind of brings us into, I'm going to skip a question here because we kind of already talked about saints,
Hmm.
but I did just do a recent video on Saint Cuthbert
Yes.
and the nature of his disability, right?
Hmm.
And what are your thoughts on disability within fantasy clergy?
Within specifically, as in clerics or fantasy world priests, etc., who
Well,
have disabilities.
yeah, exactly. Like because we have this fantasy setting, right,
Right.
where cure disease, etc., even
Right.
higher level spells like regeneration, right,
Right.
can exist.
Hmm.
Restoration, right, can exist, which you would think could, in theory, reset broken bones.
Right.
Um, and people often point to these spells as saying, well, this is why disability wouldn't exist. But then we have other
Right.
saints, such as Cuthbert, who come in and go, well, God will help me cure your afflictions, but he leaves me
Right.
with mine as kind of a service to my faith,
Yeah.
right?
I would say, first of all, in a fantasy world, even on the pure mechanical level, Not everyone's going to be able to afford that. I mean, it's classic, right? If you have a player who's got lycanthropy, we've had that happen. If they're going to go have that cured, typically there's some exchange, either a monetary exchange or some boon is asked, some quest is given. And yeah, Joe Adventurer with 30,000 gold kicking around and nothing to do with it. Sure, here you go. Or Joe Adventurer who can go plowing off into the mountains to find the sacred flower that only grows there and bring it back to the cleric, great. But, the peasants and the merchants, not so much, right? I mean, you come to a merchant who has some disease, he's not going to be plowing off into the mountains. That's not what he does, right? You come to a peasant, she has, some horrible. She doesn't have the money to pay for this. So there would still be these things. Specifically in the adventuring class, though, I would also note that there are people for whom I do think it probably would be less. It would be less frequent. It would be fewer people with disabilities in the world because they would avail themselves if they had the ability to.
Mm-hmm.
But there are people who would not. In our world, the deaf community, which is a term I don't like as if they all hang out on the same street together. But there are many people in the deaf community, though, who do not want the treatments that are available, and who actually regard the treatments available as, a form of trying to eradicate them, trying to eradicate what makes them unique. And I've got 3 kids. There's days where I'm like, yes, if I couldn't hear them, the thought of hearing them might all actually be terrifying. And to remove that peace, that quiet, it's like, no, I don't want that. That's not what I want.
Well, and we don't just
I'm fine as I am.
Well, that's the thing. We don't just see this with the deaf community. We also see this with, say, autism as well.
Yeah.
Because it's often viewed as just simply thinking differently. ADHD as
Yeah.
well has had a recent really kind of positive resurgence of not just seeing it as, say, with my Goblin video, right, which is kind of all of the negative side effects of ADHD. Really, I could produce a second video, and I might, on just how you could have the exact opposite of that, where you see, oh my God, they're unstoppable, right?
Yeah. It's we're quick to categorize, to diagnose who people are.
Mm-hmm.
The essential. This is who this person is. It's not it's not a deformity. It's not this is who they are.
But what if someone's God just says no?
That's it.
Yes, you, Mr. 10th level cleric, you're allowed to cure everyone else's afflictions, but no, you can't cure your own.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the way I view Cuthbert as an example.
Yeah, and it is an interesting thought. Like, no, I need your own disability in the world as a light, as an example to which people can point and say, God works through all people. And this person may, have something that I would consider a disability, but God is working through them. There's a wonderful show, The Chosen. It's been around online for a while now. And there's a scene in one of the actors they chose, the cast in the show. He plays James the Lesser, which is a lousy moniker to go around with in life, but it's just what the church stuck in with at one point. They call him Little James because there's a big tall guy playing the other James.
Mm-hmm.
But he walks with a limp. The actor walks with a limp. And at one point, one of the other disciples asks him, "Why haven't you asked him to heal you?" And James says, "Well, it doesn't feel right. I don't know. I mean, it would be nice to be able to run around like everyone else, but I don't know. This is kind of who I am."
Mm-hmm.
And in a later scene, he does come and ask Jesus, "Why have you never healed me?" It's Jesus is about to send his disciples out to heal people. He says, I'm going to be going out healing people. You tell me I'm going to heal people, but why have you never healed me? And it's this beautiful moment when essentially Jesus tells him, when people see God work through you, how miraculous that will be. And how will they know, how much more deeply will they know that God is present to everyone? Even if the world says, "Oh, you're broken," God isn't seeing that. That's not how God's thinking, right? So, I think it's perfectly possible that there would be people who chose not to be healed,
Mm-hmm.
people whom the deity chose not to heal, but who still had a role to play in the world, who has still had some means of well, a Christian would say grace in the world, right?
And I agree because I think we're too quick to throw away this idea that disability has no place in whether it's an adventuring party.
Right.
Now, I'm not the biggest proponent for say the combat wheelchair as an example, but it makes sense as to why it exists, right? Where if
Right.
you have an
Right.
adventurer that can't use their legs, it would make sense at least to me that they might start in a wheelchair and then eventually progress up to say the wild wild west Dr. Loveless spider legs, which
Right. Yeah.
personally I think are cool. I mean,
Or like a
Loveless, horrible guy, but cool wheelchair.
set of armor that enables a mobility or something. Yeah, something of that. Yeah.
But to where they can still keep their disability, which makes them them, but then
Hmm.
they adapt to it,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Which is a really big part of the disabled community, right?
Hmm.
Now, do you have any questions for me? I know you asked an interesting one last time, but do you have any others, any thoughts?
What should I ask you the same one this time? It's not going to be a surprise.
That's up to you. I'd answer the same either way, but do you have any?
Well, the question I asked last time, and I think it to me, given the discussion, is the most interesting one, is would you, if we lived in a fantasy world and someone came to you and said, I can restore your sight totally, would you take it?
In my left eye, sure. And as I said before, you're happy to regenerate both my eyes, absolutely, but I'll just as happily pluck the right one back out again. And now for the audience to kind of caveat this because they're going, "Oh my God, that's monstrous." In an Odinistic faith, which I guess that here's where I kind of quietly out myself as an Odinist, though I'm not one of those Odinists. I'm a very kind of quiet, private one. And in that sense, Odin gave up his eye for knowledge. He gave his eye to Mimir as well, and being born with this loss of my right eye, I see myself as kind of given up that same sacrifice. In this instance, not of my own choice, but having it thrust on me. And so, in that sense, if given the choice, I would happily make that sacrifice again. Now, would I love to have my left eye at full function? Absolutely, I would. It'd mean I'd be able to do things that I've always wanted to do, like drive or hit the ace at 300 yards, or really, those are about the only two things I want to do that I can't do. But, well, actually, being able to read again with golly gee willikers, being able to read would be swell. But, well, read without pain. But,
Yeah.
hey. But no, it's still very much my answer. And yeah, I've had like an extra week to think about it. And yeah, I wouldn't change that for anything, even if it was entirely, guaranteed and risk free. I don't
Well,
think.
and that, um, in as much as you come from it at it from an Odinist perspective, there's certainly a Christian tradition of the endurance, the taking up of one's cross, the
Mm-hmm.
taking up of the things as actually desirable. And it can sometimes go to, like as you're saying, well, that sounds horrific. It can sometimes go to a slightly creepy place, but to say that challenges that sufferings are to be embraced, right? You don't go chasing them. You don't go looking for them.
Exactly.
You don't. But they are to be embraced. Actually, historically, people have. I mean, the flagellants, right? When there would be some outbreak of plague or famine, etc., and people were certain that it was because their society was sinful and needed punishment. So people would volunteer to take flails and walk around just whipping themselves,
Yep. Yep.
right?
Or
Um, I
or
will
or
bear this on behalf of the community.
or whole religious orders are founded simply because a religious zealot wants to go climb a pole and be left alone, and yet everybody else won't. Will be climbing up on ladders after them, going, "Teach me
Yes,
your ways," and they're like, "No, shut
yes.
up, leave me alone."
The discalced orders, they don't wear shoes.
Mm-hmm.
You know that can't be comfortable. I mean, a gravel driveway would do me in. That'd be the last day for me in that order, right? Take me to the grass, I'll be with you all year, but first gravel road, I'm done.
Hot
So
sand.
that's a level of hot sand. Legos, can speak to that. There are orders that they embrace that because it is a suffering that they will endure, and as they suffer, they give that suffering to God. And it sort of requires, I mean, Odin, you know, made that sacrifice. That's an in, a route to it for an Odinist. For a
Mm-hmm.
Christian, obviously, Christ on the cross, suffering is part of the whole thing. So it's embracing and sharing with the deity something, right? So that it makes sense.
Yep,
It
and
makes sense.
Tyr gave his hand, etc., etc. And I'll come to those when I talk about, well, and actually that's gonna be my next video after this one. So yeah, that's good foreshadowing. All right, then take your opportunity here and plug your channel.
Oh, I'm the dungeon minister. As I said, yes, I'm an actual minister. I'm a priest, Anglican, so I can get married and have 3 kids. And we play a Dungeons and Dragons campaign. They had been asking about, you know, what I did when I was a kid, and I talked about Dungeons and Dragons. They wanted to try it out. And I thought we'd play a couple games and that'd be it. But it's now 4 years in, and they're doing it right now. Actually, in the kitchen, they're playing a game. So at some point, I started making videos recapping those adventures, and that's the lion's share of what my YouTube channel is. I also do some crafting, some terrain, things like that, but it's mainly the recaps. And yeah, it's been going now for 4 years, well, 3.5 years, and it's a lot of fun. It's goofy, it's silly. I have a particularly juvenile sense of humor, so if I say that someone's in a cage, then Nicolas Cage pops up on screen, things like that.
It's
Um,
great.
it's a lot of fun. It's silly, and we've also had last year and again this year we've had in-person convention,
Yeah.
Clericon, which happened last year in early November, and this year is happening at the end of October, October 25th through 27th.
Why is it always when I'm stuck teaching students?
Well, because you chose a career that sticks you with students. I don't know.
It's
Hey, tell me about it. Like I haven't spent a Christmas, off of work now for 17 years. So,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, no, but it's a convention. It happens in Ontario, and actually at our church, because in the parish hall in Glen Williams, Ontario. So
Awesome.
that's the next big project is getting that on its feet.
You'll do it.
Oh yeah, yeah. We did it once, and I had no idea what I was doing. Now I know what I'm doing, so I'll screw it up.
It's always a learning process. Well, thank you, Dungeon Minister. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
If, as always, if you ever want to come back and talk about, specific religious orders or really anything, I'd
Thanks.
love to bring you back at least sometime to get you an interview, my standard RPG interview, because you started with playing Beckme, so
Hmm.
that would be amazing as far as like academic posterity to kind of get that time capsule in. But no
I'm an
pressure.
antique.
Indeed. Indeed.
Great.
Well, thank you, sir.
Thank you.